Did you know that in 2004, Clairette Blanche was the most planted white cultivar in all of the rather famed appellation of Châteauneuf-du-Pape? Within the white blends of the region, Clairette had long been a front-runner, but as of 2021, Grenache Blanc actually overtook Clairette Blanche, pushing it into second place. But the problem with both Grenache and with Clairette Blanche is that both these cultivars are reputed to lack their own really pronounced natural acidity. And so it's still fairly common practice in those regions to blend Grenache Blanc and Clairette Blanche with cultivars like Picpoul Blanc that have incredibly high natural acidity. Incidentally, it is that naturally high acidity of Picpoul Blanc that has some more progressive viticulturists and winemakers in South Africa very excited about that cultivar's potential within some of our warmer growing regions. But back to Clairette Blanche, when it's not being blended with Picpoul Blanc in Provence or Languedoc or the Southern Rhone, it is used to make vermouth. Clairette Blanche may be on the podium in the south of France, but in South Africa it remains fairly obscure. It's only the 29th most planted cultivar in South Africa. It has about 145 hectares currently out of the 90,000 hectares in the South African winelands. But we shouldn't bash its obscurity too much, because that 145 hectares puts it ahead of cultivars like Tannat or Carignan or even Tempranillo. In fact, 145 hectares puts it roughly on a par with the relatively in vogue cultivar of Tinta Barocca that has about 150 hectares. Now we're talking about Clairette Blanche because today's HanDrinksSolo wine of the day is the Wightman & Sons Clairette Blanche 2022, which was vinified by the father and son winemaking team of Andrew and Brendan Wightman. The fruit for the wine comes from the Wightmans farm called Morelig Vineyards. It is located in the wildly popular Swartland Ward of the Paardeberg. The Wightmans are legit Swartland winemaking troopers who produce a hugely disparate series of wines, ranging from the truly bizarre but aptly named Different Box of Frogs Carignan, because it really is a different box of frogs, or the super zany early harvest False Widow Pinotage, which you'd be forgiven for mistaking for a glass of unfiltered cranberry juice, or even through to the slightly riper but still delightfully unhinged Irreverence Mataro. And they go all the way through to also producing some rather classic genre-defining natural white wines. And when I use the term natural wines, I do mean that they adhere fairly stringently to a natural winemaking ethos, which also fits within the manifesto of the independent Swartland producers. Now for me, the sweet spot in the Wightman & Sons range lies within their white wines, but you'd be a little short-sighted not to at least engage with their red wines as well, especially because they're the sorts of wines that really make you question any rigid definition that you might have attached to the beverage in the first place. Now, unfortunately for those of you who may have been hoping for something super zany and insane, this Clairette Blanche is remarkably compos mentis, but natty wine nuts will be quite stoked to see that there is an ever so subtle haze on the wine, and this is because it's undergone only the coarsest of filtering. Now when we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, I mean, it really is a little bit of a show off on the nose. There's some delightfully edgy kind of elements of pear cider, and then there's also smoky phenols that drift along and surround some interesting bruised yellow apple notes. And moving on, there's then just boatloads of kind of fresh jasmine and frangipani florals. And really, I guess we shouldn't be too surprised, because it's exactly this kind of explosive floral and fresh fruit aroma that has made Clairette Blanche as famous as it is in other parts of the world. So when we progress onto tasting the wine, a classic wine drinker may be tempted to prepare themselves for disappointment because of Clairette's reputation for lacking acidity. So let's actually give it a taste and see what we're in for. Well, it does indeed have relatively mild acidity, and yet there is such a heavy load of waxy, delicious, layered, rich texture. And so some might argue that in this particular instance, less acidity might mean more enjoyment. As I said earlier, in keeping with the Wightman's fairly natural winemaking ethos, there's almost no filtration. So you're getting the maximum impact of any of those solid particles of perhaps grapes or the lees that are still suspended in the wine. Now, as I mentioned earlier, texture is a big deal, and there's this waxiness which is really quite prevalent. In part comes from the fact that Clairette Blanche in itself is quite a waxy cultivar. But then again, the very, very coarse filtering means that some of that texture is probably also coming from the lees in the wine. Another thing to notice about the character of the wine is that a lot of the fruit elements we taste are fairly oxidative. So there's this really delightful pear cider aroma that I mentioned, and that's on the palate as well. And we've talked about in other videos how acetobacter can produce what's called volatile acidity, and in the presence of oxygen, that can work together to give these sort of cider elements, which in this context, I think is absolutely beautiful. Another thing I experienced was that the apple note on the palate it's bruised yellow apple, as opposed to perhaps what you might expect from a more protectively made wine where there's no oxygen, where you'd get fresher, crisper, perhaps green apple or green pear. But this is very different. So along with those oxidative bruised apple elements, there's also a slightly surlier, savory, saltier element. There's perhaps a little touch of salted almond maybe. Finally, the texture that we mentioned earlier that is kind of greets you up front on the palate, that pushes right deep into the finish. And on the finish, you get an encore of those jasmine and frangipani floral elements that we smelt in the beginning. So you've got this sort of full circle complete of floral, gentle, fresh fruit coming in into more surlier, bruised, oxidative apple and touches of nuts. And then you've got the waxy texture, and that carries you all the way through back into the tail where there's this floral flourish. It really is a hugely distinctive wine, and I think one of the most fascinating bottles that really must be experienced from this part of the Swartland. So that's all we have time for today. But if you have any questions about Clairette Blanche in South Africa, or about the Wightmans, or about the Swartland, then leave questions on the website and I will get back to you. If you enjoyed the video, then help us make more of them by supporting us on Patreon, and also subscribe to the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, where we produce at least 6 videos each month, and we talk about wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars like Clairette Blanche, and some of the rising winemaking stars like the Wightmans that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine.